Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Seth Godfrey. I'm manager of adult services, and I'm very proud and honored to be here with our Book Sandwiched In program today. We're welcoming Professor Jane Gordon and Professor Drucilla Cornell to this wonderful talk, authors of Creolizing Rosa, Luxemburg. And I'd like to just start off with some intros for our guest today. Jane Anna Gordon is professor of political science with affiliations in American Studies, El Instituto, Philosophy and Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies at University of Connecticut. She's author of Statelessness and Contemporary Enslavement, Creolizing Political Theory and Why They Couldn't Wait. Co-author of A Divine Warning and co-editor of not only Master's Tools, a companion to African American Studies, Creolizing Rousseau, Journeys in Caribbean Thought, and the Politics of Richard Wright. She was president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association from 2014 to 2017, and continues to direct the CPA Summer School and co-edit the organization's two-book series, Creolizing the Canon and Global Critical Caribbean Studies. She was executive editor with Lewis R. Gordon of the Open Access Journal, Philosophy and Global Affairs. Drucilla Cornell is an emeritus professor of political science, women's studies, and comparative literature at Rutgers University. She's a produced playwright. Cornell also launched the Ubuntu Project in South Africa in 2003 and has been working with the project ever since. Cornell's theoretical and political writings span a tremendous range of both topics and disciplines, from her early work in critical legal studies and feminist theory to her more recent work on South Africa, transitional justice, and the jurisprudence of Ronald Dworkin. Cornell continues to think through new and evolving issues in philosophy and politics of global significance. Her latest title, forthcoming in the Global Critical Caribbean Thought Series with Roman and Littlefield, is called Today's Struggle, Tomorrow's Revolution, Afro-Caribbean Liberatory Thought. Thank you for joining us. And just so you're starting off.
Yes, thank you again so much for organizing this event. And of course, to you, Jane, for making a dream come true. I'm a technological dinosaur, which is why I'm a nervous wreck whenever I do this, but now I have in-house tech support. Rosa Luxemburg has never been more relevant. And this, of course, brings up the Ukraine and resistance against Russian fascism, because let's not call it Russian nationalism. It's the fascist attempt to take over and deny national sovereignty of Ukrainians, and they are fighting back on the ground. So, of course, they have a professional army, but the real resistance is becoming obvious that it's the people themselves that are mobilizing. And Rose always said that we really only have one choice. We're either going to go for democratic socialism, our choice, we're going to fall into barbarism. And barbarism isn't just a Ukraine-Russian horrifying invasion right now. It's also the pandemic and the way it was handled, the inequality of who got the vaccines and who didn't get the vaccines. It was, interestingly, Cuba came up with its own vaccine and is currently distributing it for free to Africa, something that's not known in the United States because we never want to say anything good about Cuba. And it's actually a different kind of vaccine. So that you have this continuation of horrific events. There's inequality in the United States is almost so horrifying, there's no words for it. Where you have 3 or 5 men almost owning more money than not only all of the 5 major nation states in the European Union, but of the 98% of the population in the United States. Jeff Bezos is building another spaceship after breaking the union at Amazon. And frankly, I hope he crashes. I try not to have negative thoughts like that. Rosa really put it starkly. We are either going to have barbarism or we're going to have democratic socialism. And one of the things that she does theoretically is she makes it clear that what's called primitive accumulation, the violence that comes with the early stages of capitalism, it's not just a stage, it's capitalism, which means that it's not surprising in her magnum opus, The Accumulation of Capital, that she associates the violence of imperialism with capitalism per se, and that it's necessary for capitalism to survive, to constantly subject other peoples, to create gross inequality, and also to perpetuate endless war, which is what we've seen, of course, in the 20th century. Afghanistan lasted over 20 years and of course, accomplished nothing in Rosa's sense of the word. I have formed a peace group with my comrade Ants Nitow, supporting the Revolutionary Association of Afghan Women, which were an on-the-ground group that was a government in exile just to be on the ballot. And so what Rosa's socialist feminism always reminds us is that feminism is not just about the freedom to get your hair dyed. It's the freedom of women on the ground to be able to mobilize their own resources to be in government. The Revolutionary Association of Afghan Women was an on-the-ground association that ran the gynecological clinics, ran the schools. And yes, they were armed because they had fought in the war of what was then the Soviet Union. So you have Rosa always looking as a socialist feminist to a different way of thinking about feminism. And that's so relevant to me right now, not only because International Women's Day was Tuesday, but also because of the issues and attacks on women's rights in the United States. Over 21 states have passed severe limitations on the right to abortion, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's now, in Texas, the governor has accepted and signed legislation to allow any trans child who's accepted as a trans child to be considered a child of abuse. So the whole movement for people being able to exercise what I've called their imaginary domain is under severe attacks. And Rosa's socialist feminist, which is what Anne and I tried to look to in 2001 against the, oh, isn't it great we don't have to wear headscarves, is never been more important as we try to see our way through the connections between the attacks on critical race theory, the banning of Toni Morrison, she's banned now in 17 states, and the whole movement to shut down critical thinking. The Caribbean Philosophical Association is absolutely crucial in building institutional support for the way in which we can make critical theory available and possible. This is why I'm very honored to be publishing. Well, we published already in one of Jane Lewis and series, but I will be publishing again because we need those kinds of institutions. And those institutions are what Rosa believed in, was mainly unions. In her day, my daughter became a union organizer at the museum, PS1 MoMA. And these young people who are showing us that the spirit of Rosa lives on. So for her, those organizations remain the unions. But we now know that there's different kinds of organizations that are rising up. Black Lives Matter, obviously, is a critical one. I think the importance of her, though, is that she always emphasizes democratic socialism, and that if democracy does not come into the economy, then all you have is the violence of primitive accumulation, imperialism, and war. And that's what she always emphasized, that we don't really know what socialism is. As she said, we have some negative degrees, but we don't really know what it is. And I think it's very important to remember here that there are actually two 9/11s. The first 9/11 in my life was when Salvador Allende locked himself into an office and took on an army, a man who was absolutely against seizing state power for the armed struggle. And he was a fan of Rosa Luxemburg. He believed deeply that the way he took power through the parliament, through democracy, was absolutely essential to the kind of leadership in which new forms of being together would actually be practiced and a new way of being human together. And so whenever I think of 9/11, I don't just think of the Twin Towers and the tragedy that happened there. I think of Salvador Allende reminding us, as he put it, but even though I die today, these are his words, which drilled into my head, even though I die today, the dream of a democratic world in which we will find justice together will not die with me. I put it in your hands. And I think Rosa Luxemburg would say, yes, it's now in our hands. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Drucilla. So I'll go next. I wanted also to begin by thanking the New Haven Public Library for organizing and hosting our conversation, especially to Drucilla for being my partner in crime in the production of this book, really the conceptualization and production of the book, and to everyone who's made time to join with us. So I'm actually going to read briefly from Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg. I wanted first to share the book's dedication, which is to Rosa Luxemburg. And it's a quotation from Hannah Senesh, who was another Eastern European Jewish woman intellectual and revolutionary. And I'm going to put a link just about her in the chat because she's fascinating in her own right. And this just seemed like such a fitting way to address Rosa. So this is the book's cover. It's also behind Seth, if you wanted to see it. And I'm just going to read briefly from the dedication and then from the introduction. So the dedication says this. It says, to Rosa, there are stars whose radiance is visible on Earth, though they've long been extinct. There are people whose brilliance continues to light the world, even though they are no longer among the living. These lights are particularly bright when the night is dark. They light the way for humankind. And then the introduction is called, it's also a line from one of Rosa's many, many letters. And so that we named it from one of those letters. So the introduction is called, I have 1,000 more things I want to say to you. And so I'm going to read briefly from the beginning of it, which explains what we mean when we say that we're creolizing Rosa. And then I'm going to read briefly from the end, which addresses what we thought about how one learns to fight in political terms from Rosa. So there's no question that Rosa Luxemburg was a radiant star. The clarity of her vision lit up a widened horizon of possibility. Her boldness offered direction. The aim of our volume is to revisit her prescient insights through the lens of creolizing theory to illustrate how timely they are right now. Creolizing as an approach to political theory draws insights and orientation from creolizing processes in and beyond the Caribbean. In creolized elements of life, whether speech or food, reasoning or music, forms of activity tied to groups of people who were supposed to be radically unequal and separated, in fact, combined in ways that were unpredictable, surprising, and recognizable. Used as an approach to ideas, creolizing takes two primary forms. The first is historical and reconstructive, aiming to identify relations of influence and indebtedness that have been hidden or obscured. In its constructive mode, creolizing stages conversations that could not have taken place historically, but that would have been and remain generative. The creolizing endeavor is not undertaken randomly. The aim is to put different, previously sequestered sides of a shared political situation together to explore the results. Rosa Luxemburg as a person, thinker, and revolutionary is particularly amenable to creolizing. This is in part because she was self-creolizing, even if she never would have used that language. In her own life, she repeatedly demonstrated an appreciation that it was not only people and sites with recognized institutional authority that offered perspectives that were indispensable. In her research, she followed where the questions led, not stopping where conventions might have suggested was appropriate. Indeed, in her engagements with the past and with her present, she went where she thought fundamental social transformation was underway, whether or not doing so was safe or sanctioned. She brought into the historical record human struggle that she worried had been forgotten and remained open to being disproven about her own political expectations. For Rosa, critical consciousness involved an understanding of the interconnectivity of things, of then and now, of here and there, of us and them, of I and you. This understanding was reflected in Rosa's approach to politics, which for her was enacted on the street and in the head, on the campaign trail and at the desk, on the political platform and in her private letters to friends and associates. She always sought to put her intellect unconditionally at the disposal of what she saw as the common good. But the actual nature of this public good couldn't be articulated in one center and simply emanated outward. None of this is to say that Rosa offered us divine tablets. Suggesting that she did would contradict her approach to thought and action. Instead, we contend that figures like African Americans W.E.B. Du Bois and Lorraine Hansberry, Martinican Frantz Fanon, and Trinidadian C.L.R. James and Claudia Jones extended many of Rosa's fundamental insights by revisiting them through the lens and lessons of the global South. Rosa could not have asked whether human caravans crossing the Americas were engaged in what she would call a mass strike. But this is not an indictment. Rather, we see ourselves as underscoring the immense value of Rosa's work by putting it into relationship with peoples, ideas, and contexts that her writing suggests would have interested her, but that she herself could not have encountered directly. In so doing, we see ourselves as responding to her invitation to carry her spirit and intellectual project forward. So then skipping ahead to the end. What does it mean to learn how to fight from a woman murdered at 47 in 1919 as part of a struggle that did not successfully seize state power and that therefore was seen by many as not only beaten, but discredited? Rosa had a profoundly pedagogical understanding of what it meant to be even brutally defeated. When grappling with historical setbacks, in particular struggles, including the attempt to establish a socialist republic in Germany, her first question was what lessons the losses offered. Rosa understood that revolutionary struggles would take place over a long period of time, and that the ultimate goal of seizing state power and overthrowing capitalism would involve series of partial victories and partial setbacks. This offered an important reminder that radically transforming the world is no easy undertaking. As she writes, the socialist transformation presupposes a long and stubborn struggle in the course of which quite probably the proletariat will be repulsed more than once. But crucially, steps forward were enabled by, literally made upon, previous defeats, which were indispensable in nurturing collective strength and clarity of purpose. In addition to having a highly constructive approach to defeat, many have rightly emphasized Rosa's bravery. It was as evident in her many life decisions as in her readiness to think and step into the unknown. At the very heart of her many disagreements with supposed comrades was the point that we do not and cannot know what socialism is in advance. This is in part because we have been inculcated by exploitative relationships out of which we cannot just imagine our way out. Unlike many who invoke it, Rosa was actually comfortable with the possibility of enacting her freedom and seeking with others to birth the new. When doing so, she did not deny her intellectual or political indebtedness to those who came before her. Instead, she saw her actions as the extension of what it meant to continue the project inaugurated by Marx, even as she debated Marx himself. She would repeatedly call out even the most esteemed in her circles. This was neither edible nor done for the sake of being irreverent. For her, being a comrade meant pushing one's comrades not to be lazy in their thinking or in their actions. Rosa insisted that socialism and freedom were compatible, and that the protection of basic freedom was necessary for the imagination of and struggle to build new socialist relations. She once wrote that freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently. This was her recognizing that the one who thinks differently might be just the dreamer we need, the artist who makes us see differently, the poet who beckons us to another world, the housewife who insists that domestic chores must be shared. This was not then an empty liberal maxim, so much as a call to open avenues to reconsider how we can radically transform the ways we live together. Rosa brought to the fight a sober assessment of what she uniquely could contribute. In her case, this was her intellect, imagination, capacity for human relations, and ferocious energy. She also had an understanding, if abbreviated by her murder, that one had in the face of individual instances of suffering to sustain and work at maintaining life-affirming vitality and joy through varieties of forms of intimacy or ways of connecting with human and other than human others. It is easy to sit on the sidelines and despair. That is and has always been true. Perhaps at moments when our ability to change the exploitative relations of capitalism and imperialism seems small, Rosa's message to all of us is that we cannot know of defeat in advance. We cannot know what possibilities any particular struggle will yield. We do not struggle only because we think we can win, or even that we can hope to win. We struggle because we want to live more human lives by investing in and with others to build a new world. From such a vantage point, pessimism is not only irrelevant, the pessimists throw themselves on the wrong side of history. So we read Rosa today because she calls on us to rethink her ideas by creolizing them so that she can continue to speak to the most burning issues of our time.
Well, it looks like we have some questions coming in, and would you like to take questions, or you want to? Something from Vito Pasqualoni. I think it's addressing what Drucilla brought up. The Ukrainian government, Russian separatists, have been fighting for nearly 8 years. The Ukrainian government has attacked homes, schools, and hospitals. Human Rights Watch, security forces of the Ukrainian government are guilty of torture, murder, and disappearances. Amnesty International Report 2021. Would you call this barbarism or democratic socialism, to use your terms? Because I know, Rosa wrote a lot about the Ukraine. It was certainly central. So I guess.
You want to take that, Jane?
Oh.
Go ahead and I'll follow you.
Okay. I don't really see what's going on right this second, because it is going on right this second, as a battle for democratic socialism. When the Soviet Union broke up, the Ukraine proceeded to create a democracy in the bourgeois democratic sense. They have elections and they have freedom to protest and they have some freedom of the press. But the idea of returning to the Soviet Union was so repugnant to so many that the Ukrainian government had pretty much embraced capitalism. And we're not seeing today a fight of a democratic socialist society against a fascist Russia. What we're seeing is a more conventional battle for national sovereignty, but against fascism. But as it spills over, and this is my hope for it, as people have the experience of collectively fighting together, it transforms you. And I'm hoping that that transformation, which we don't know where it might go, might lead to a questioning what capitalism has brought and has not brought to the Ukraine. So, although I wouldn't say as it is right this minute, second, as I said, a battle for democratic socialism, the on-the-ground nature of the resistance is going to change people and perhaps make them really rethink what they became when they became the Ukraine, separate from Russia after the Soviet Union broke up.
Yeah, I would just add to what Drucilla's already said that I don't see either side as battling meaningfully for democratic socialism right now. I do think that I've been thinking a lot. I was saying to Drucilla and Seth before you logged on that I've been thinking about what Rosa would say if she were watching this on the ground right now, because of course she experienced the colonization of Poland by Russia. That was her childhood, was watching Russian tanks in Poland, in Warsaw, and the radical inequalities that it created along with the industrializing of Eastern Europe. But at the same time, when even Marx and Engels were defending Polish self-determination, she thought they were wrong because she thought individual instances of national self-determination empowered bourgeoisies and isolated the working class from one another. That all of the tension that could have gone into building meaningful solidarities across nations was sort of channeled internal to them. And so I think we see the exact same thing going on right now. I mean, I have to say I'm genuinely moved by seeing Ukrainian grandmothers yelling at armed Russian soldiers, telling fascists to get the hell out of their country. At the same time, they are mobilizing in the language of national self-determination and the determination of the nation state. But I agree completely with Drucilla that I can't believe that the experience of determining that they themselves will fight, often they themselves developing weapons and receiving money to arm themselves, people who've never fought in an organized military in their lives. I can't believe that that won't have lasting consequences for how they think about the role of citizens in the development of new political forms, which we need desperately everywhere.
And just to follow up to this question, it's just, I mean, in line with Rosa's thing about freedom, and freedom is for those who think differently. How can we apply this to the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice against Israeli apartheid? So it's.
Well, do you want me to jump in first, Jane, or do you want
Sure.
to?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm happy to follow.
Israeli apartheid is a very, very, very important question, maybe one of the central questions, because Palestinians are not allowed to have even freedom in the most basic sense. Here, in one of the debates in our book, I would say there is a struggle for territorial national self-determination in Palestine, and that there should be given territory and Israel should get the hell out of their country. So I had a debate with one of our comrades in the book, Peter Hudis, who convinced me that perhaps I was a little too light on Rosa when her criticisms of self-determination. As in Palestine, I think that the need to push Israel out and to have a coherent territory is one step, just one step, towards a Palestine that could then move to different forms of collective action. Because all you've really been able to do in Palestinian mobilization is reactive, fight against Israel, because you are constantly under attack and they're constantly stealing your territory and they're constantly denying you even rights to go into Israel to work. I mean, you're just constantly struggling for survival. And I think that if we were to get the end Israeli apartheid, I'm willing to use that word, then we might get to the stage in which Palestinians could, for the first time, stop having to just fight for survival and begin to think about what kind of state they want. There are a number of Palestinian socialist groups. They're out there, and they think the answer is socialism and the end of capitalism, and they've said so. So, we won't even really be able to see that until the hand of Israel is lifted off the backs of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I would just add to that I see Rosa as being a part of that very hugely important dissenting tradition within Jewish political thought that really is radically against the idea of Jews having their own nation state. Hermann Cohen is part of that tradition. Hannah Arendt for a period was part of that position. I'm definitely part of that transition. I just take it as a very serious historical fate and destiny to be an exilic people whose role is to push wherever one finds it oneself in more progressive and left-wing directions. That, of course, doesn't say anything to the fact that there is an Israeli nation state, and so we're therefore responsible for it. But I know with absolute certainty that she would have said, no, we need a global socialism, not one more nation state, that this time in the hands and names of the Jews. And I think she's right. But at the same time, there is an Israeli state, so you have to speak to it. And so there's part of me that does know that Israel is held to a higher standard and that there are people who are offended and hurt by that. Whereas I take the position that it's absolutely right to hold Israel to a higher standard, that if Jews claim to answer to a kind of political ethics that's of a higher order, then people make demands on you to rise to that. And I'm in absolute agreement with that. And I do think that the Israel state, I know all the reasons why people don't like the comparison of Israel to South African apartheid, but as the daughter of South African Jews who grew up in South African apartheid, I actually think the comparison is a very apt one. That said, and this is where Rosa, I think, is equally important, is that there are different approaches to decolonial and anti-colonial struggle, right? There are Palestinians who are not socialists, just as there are many, many, many who are. And one of the things that I admire most about Rosa, and I think Drucilla was absolutely right to couple Rosa with Frantz Fanon, is there were two people who were committed revolutionaries and who understood that when you're the underdog, you need unity of the fiercest kind, but that unity is really held together by room for dissenting and open thought. And that it's not revolutionary to think that you have all the answers in advance and to push out people who claim to think otherwise. Because if you're trying to create something that's not yet existent, you need to hear all of those things. And it's not a liberal wishy-washyism. It's a committed and realistic commitment to the possibility of human transformation. And so I think Rosa would have been absolutely on the side of the Palestinians and a fierce internal critic of how best to realize the stated aims of Palestinian liberation.
I'd like to say, as an American Jew, I consider my homeland the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. How else can you get a great bar mitzvah? So, I hope she would, whatever Rosa would think of that. But anyways, the question of self-determination, it's interesting, and I'm fascinated. I know we'll probably never know what went on with her and Lenin in Finland. I mean, these discussions, which must have been interesting. I mean, so maybe go into a little bit of that. How do they differ, Lenin and Rosa, about self-determination? It's fascinating to me. And I think if you could just maybe reflect on that a bit. Oh.
No, one of the great things about editing a book with wonderful contributors is you get in struggles with them. I'm really an anti-nationalist. I am. I think the only way forward is global organizing, and that's the only way forward for socialism. And I did read Rosa with Fanon, and I think there's a great deal of creolizing Rosa through Fanon, who also saw all the limits in Africa of national self-determination, so-called. And so I think that what Peter convinced me was that at times she, like we all make mistakes, she couldn't see what both Jane and I are calling the possibilities in the Ukraine. She was so anti-self-determination that she couldn't sometimes see her own allies in the Polish Socialist Party, who were also very for self-determination. She turned her head away from allies, and that was very unlike her. So I hold on to my position, but there's something right about Rosa's critique of self-determination. And because you can't get self-determination. As long as you have global capitalism, it's an illusion. I mean, and countries that have tried it, brilliant experiments like Jules Nyerere, he wanted to create an independent country based on not industrializing, to really see a different way called Yumaya of people living together. And what happens? You get smacked because you can't build enough of an economy to feed the people that you're very much trying to mobilize. And then what happens? It's the same old story. You borrow money from the IMF, and then you're done. We saw the same thing in Syriza in Greece. So I am really, I couldn't be stronger when I say that this is one tiny little planet. And I normally don't promote movies, but in my darkest hours, I have been watching Don't Look Up with Meryl Streep playing the sociopathic fascist, because what it emphasizes is that the earth is just this tiny little ball, and we need to understand it as that, and we need to act at that level. So yes, I accept Peter's criticisms of Rosa and of me, that, she could have seen some allies, because what Jane said is right. Usually she was really good at saying, okay, I disagree with you, but we're in this fight together. And she didn't see that with some of her allies, and that was a mistake on her part. Still, it's global or nothing as far as I'm concerned.
Can I just say, for folks, and again, I want to plug the book, filling it up. That's Drucilla's referring to Peter Hudis, who wrote the chapter "A Troubled Legacy: Rosa Luxemburg and the Non-Western World." So,
Seth, could I take a turn at answering too?
please.
Sure, because no, I think what Drucilla said when she began is exactly right. That one of the things that's such a rich opportunity about editing a volume of this kind is you have people people for whom you have such profound respect and can also disagree. And I think that became clearest around this exact question. And so, for instance, one of the things that I think is really interesting about Rosa's position on national self-determination is first of all, just the very fact, right, that the Communist Manifesto ends with a chapter defending Polish self-determination, and she thinks it's wrong, right? So this is one of the most widely circulated documents. She's very concerned with the peripheralization of Poland, and yet she disagrees, which I just think is fascinating to begin with. But some of Rosa's most important critics were CLR James and Raya Denevskaya, and they disagreed with her on exactly this question, right? Because they thought it was absolutely true that you needed a globalism, but they thought to get to a globalism that wouldn't be Eurocentric, you did need national self-determination movements. And so CLR James and Raya Denevskaya really did defend national self-determination movements in Black America, in Latin America, in Africa, and they knew they had to open up to something else. But they thought that the process of fighting those movements developed a kind of self-understanding and self-knowledge and unique vocabularies that were absolutely key if you were going to have a globalism that actually reflected the full members of the working class of the world. And so it's interesting. So when you read her along with Frantz Fanon, she helps you to see things that Fanon is saying far better, right? So when Frantz Fanon is arguing about the Algerian Revolution, he says very explicitly, there would have been no Algerian Revolution if there weren't revolutions going on in other parts of the global South. It was seeing that momentum that enabled them to join them. But there is a point at which things become too internal, where everybody suddenly is fighting in parallel rather than an ongoing conversation in ways that enables the distinctive revolutions not to each get internally hijacked. And so there are a lot of people who are arguing now that Fanon was right in arguing for an Algerian revolution, but for it to actually be achieved, it needed to become transnational, that you couldn't just have national consciousness, you needed transnational consciousness because capitalism is global. And so if you're going to match it, you need a similarly global moment. But I do think that there's a lot to be said for CLR James and Raya Denevskaya's sort of internal critique of Rosa, right? Which is that self-determination will not translate into determination, meaningful determination, or anything like revolution, but it does have a dialectical role to play in developing a fuller sense of who makes up the globe and a sense that each of those parts of the globe know how to fight in their own right. So I have a sort of internal critique of Rosa on that point, because I agree. Polish self-determination just emboldened the Polish petty bourgeoisie over and against the local working classes. That's true. But I do think, just as we're seeing in Ukraine right now, that people in Ukraine are going to be changed forever by the fight that they're waging now. And the question will be, are they pushed towards socialism or barbarism once mobilized? But that's a question that Rosa helps us to ask.
We've a lot of questions coming in, very patient. Someone called anonymous attendee, why do you think people tend to conflate socialism with dictatorships?
And you want me to start, Jane?
Go for it.
Well, I think that's a dreadful mistake. Socialism is the exact opposite of dictatorship, whatever it is, because we don't know what it is. But why Rosa is so important is Rosa said that we needed the widest possible participation, as Jane described it, with the poets, the painters, the housewives, everyone who thought they were in a place that they could never get out of. It's about dreaming big and thinking that there's a new humanity possible. Fanon was not a capitalist. He was anti-capitalist. He was socialist. I mean, this is part of Fanon that gets missed, which I'm always emphasizing in him, because he knew that you can't possibly have freedom under capitalism. Capitalism is about exploitation. I mean, obviously Marx taught us that. So why do we associate it with dictatorship? And the answer is twofold. When I was a kid, I was in democratic centralist organizations. I got kicked out of all of them for being, in one case, a deviationist idealist. And I'm not sure what a deviationist idealist is, but I'm kind of proud of it.
It's being a Rosa Luxemburgian.
It was being a Luxemburgian. And a lot of this had to do with the idea that, if you'll forgive me for using, sort of fancy words, phallic control of women. And I got kicked out of one group just because I was asked to perform a sex act on a member of the Central Committee. And he said that was socialism. And I said, not in Rosa Luxemburg. There's nothing about having to give sex acts to men. No, I get to be a free, self-defining woman. And that was the end of me in that organization. The reason dictatorship came in, and it's a problem, is in Cuba, for instance, is that the only way you can hold power is by not allowing those who disagree to aside, this is the global point, to align themselves with the United States. How many assassination attempts do you think Fidel Castro underwent? And he lived in ripe old age, says a lot. But on the other hand, so you can't hold power because you're going to have your enemies aligned with the United States, like in the Bay of Pigs, which is, John F. Kennedy's horrible blunder, to overthrow Fidel. From the time Fidel took power, there was nothing but intensive attempts to overthrow him. And that leads to the idea that dictatorship is the only way to expropriate the expropriators, etc. And then you have the major challenge to that idea, Salvador Allende. No, we are not going to forsake democracy. We are going to hold power by being even more democratic. We are going to expropriate the expropriators. We have to. We even can try to do that in a new way. But what happened to Salvador Allende? And one of our comrades, Oscar Guardiola Vera, he tells us it was a story of death foretold. Henry Kissinger said on the day he was elected, "You are looking at a dead man." And then they, for the next few years, systematically tried to murder Salvador Allende. And by not surrendering, he gave us a message that you mustn't surrender either, that only one man dies today. And he said, this is why socialism gets, this is not the colonies of the Soviet Union, which is what happened after World War II, where four guys got together and said, okay, you get this country, we get this country, the Monroe Doctrine, the United States gets all South America. How many attempts at revolution have there been in South America that have been systematically thwarted by the assassination or the systematic violent destruction of those movements? You have the Sandistas, you have Nicaragua. And so what happens then, there's the dialectical move to dictatorship. Well, we'll have to hold power at all costs. And that doesn't work either. And this gets back to Jane's point about even if you work as he was working in Chile, Salvador Allende was a globalist. He knew that he had to build a South American community if he was going to survive. And so that's what keeps happening. So, when Bernie Sanders said, well, there's a lot of good things about Cuba. A, it has the highest literacy rate in the world. B, it has free dental care for someone like me who's worried about dental bills. You go to Cuba, you get your teeth fixed for free. People say, that's no big deal. Well, you have free medical care. You have free hospitalization. It's number one in the world, according to the UN, in terms of healthcare delivery. That is the other side. of Cuba. And what I hope now is that perhaps Cuba will not just privatize and go over to capitalism, but begin to see that the people aren't the enemy, even those who disagree. The problem is always, though, the alignment with the United States.
And you were saying, Drucilla, before folks joined, that Cuba right now has been making vaccines and sending them to Africa. Right.
For free.
For free.
Some of the best scientists in the world.
And they developed the anti-cancer vaccine, so it's really remarkable in the biomedical. And it's too bad the blockade. Question from Marie Martorano. Jane, I was very excited to see your letter in Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung's 150th anniversary book. Post Rosa, Letters Against Barbarism. I love how you incorporated a quote about songs with your own experiences of music as a form of protest. I had a similar experience to yours during the pandemic, particularly with the televised murder of George Floyd and the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. With music of my Gen X, millennial generation, revisiting Rage Against the Machine and finding new songs by other upcoming artists. What other songs speak to you in this way? And since we all seem to connect using our music, do you believe it has the ability to unite us so we can affect real change?
It's a great question, and thank you for it. I'm happy to answer, but I would also love, if you don't mind, if you would share some of the music and art that's really moving you right now, because it'd be great for us all to share among ourselves. But the songs that I'd mentioned in that project, and let me just say a couple words about the project just because it was fantastic. It was a collection of correspondences where lovers of Rosa in different parts of the globe were paired. And we wrote to each other during the pandemic about just how it was that we were thinking and what we were doing, drawing on insights from Rosa. And the person with whom I corresponded is based in Wuhan, and she's a political theorist who teaches there. And I had said to her that the Resistance Revival Chorus, which is a group of women who joined in the aftermath of Trump's election, they just did the most wonderful songs, but they did a version of Woody Guthrie's All These Fascists Bound to Lose. And they sang it beautifully, but they put together a video with just footage of people protesting all over the globe with women in leadership. And I was saying that there's something about that song that was so moving because it promises victory at the same time as it basically says we need to win that victory. But there's something about confidence in the possibility that enables us to keep fighting. And they also sang a song called This Joy. And it's a very simple song, but it basically says, this joy that I have wasn't given to me. This joy that I have wasn't given to me. This joy that I have wasn't given to me. The world can't give it. The world can't take it away. And I was really struck by how much that connected to Rosa, especially as she wrote in prison. Because she insisted that people continue to be their own sources of optimism and vitality and human connection, and really sort of schooled and scorned people when they failed to do that. And I thought what was so brilliant about this song, which was sung by a group of Black women, was their whole point was that their joy, their existence, their flourishing was not the aim of the world in which we live, that it was self-generated. And because it was self-generated, it can be squelched, people can try to put it out, but if it's self-generated, there's an extent to which it can also be self-sustained. And I was saying that one of the things about this period is there's a lot of squelching going on, even for those who are working incredibly hard to maintain themselves and their own sources of joy. But that song too, I mean, what's interesting about the song itself is it enables you to sort of replenish those human resources. And so some of the other things I would just mention as examples, I have to say, I like all the old stuff. So my examples tend not to be new. That's some of the newest music I've been listening to. But I think Nina Simone's version of I Wish I Knew How It Felt to Be Free, How It Feels to Be Free, continues to be one of the most moving songs ever recorded. Or Rahsaan Roland Kirk's version of Bright Moments. Or my daughter, like Drucilla's daughter, is a visual artist, and she recently put together a portrait, a self-portrait that emulates the Japanese technique where vases and precious items are broken and then they're pasted back together with a gold paint, a gold glue. And the whole point is that the beauty is how broken things can reconstitute themselves. And I think it's just such a gorgeous and important message for right now, that we live in a profoundly broken world. And that means that we too are profoundly broken. But the measure of our political wisdom and value is how we fix the world so that we too can mend each other. But I would love to hear other folks' things that are keeping you going. And I do think that one of the things that Rosa underscored so powerfully is that we're multifaceted people. And so our revolutionary politics and our political thinking needs to reflect that full multifacetedness.
What about you, Seth? What songs keep you going?
Well, number one, I want people to look in the back. I'm just paying tribute to Rosa as someone who loves plants, and it sort of got me through the pandemic. And I just love that chapter. What was it? By Maria Starsman, Rosa Luxemburg, Nature Imprisonment. I mean, it's just this. I think for most of us, some brightening up our indoors, and it's just kind of refreshing. And since we're all in a prison, I mean, I don't want to diminish what she went through, but in terms of just bringing that, this greatness of nature inside and reflecting on it, and just appreciating how it's very interesting. Someone wrote about Dick Gaughan, the Scottish. I loved his work. I know this. I actually met him in Moscow in 1985 during the youth festival. And it's kind of ironic. His song was "The Russians Want War," but I know he's reared in Scotland, and fabulous voice. And I mean, I love Cardi B. How can I? Just because she supported Bernie, it's like it's funny for a 64-year-old Jewish guy to say he loves Cardi B. I guess it's kind of an anomaly, but I'll admit it. All right, we're on Zoom. What the hell, How about you, Drucilla? How about you? What do you?
I like really old songs like Bread and Roses. Really old song. I went to the marches on International Women's Day, and I was kind of thrilled that they sang Bread and Roses, because the mill where 147 women died in 6 minutes is just right across the street from me at Washington Square Park. So I tend to like, I even like, there once was a Union maid who never was afraid. Welcome. So I really like, it's age. I like the really, really, really old songs, even the International, right? Rise, you prisoners of starvation. I still get teary-eyed over that. But I think there's been a lot of new songs, and I love the story song because I think that is Rosa. And that's sort of what I think both Jane and I are emphasizing about the Ukraine. They're building their own story, and we don't know what it's going to come out like. And that's a Rosa insight. Who knew that, grandmothers would be building Molotov cocktails, and they didn't, like 2 weeks ago.
And I have to say the fiercest diss of this moment was that Ukrainian grandmother who took sunflower seeds and handed them to an armed soldier and said, put them in your pockets, so when you die, at least sunflowers will grow out of the dirt. The sunflowers are the Ukrainian national flower.
I love that. Talk about poetry.
Yes.
I want to ask you, have any of you seen the film by Margaret von Tratta, Rosa Luxemburg?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have seen it.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think Barbara Sucker won Academy Award, Cannes '86. So it's a remarkable film. We had it at the library, but someone ripped it off. So good or bad, I don't know. At least I hope they're enjoying it, but we're deprived. It's tough to get because it was only on VHS. So it's a great film. It was.
The one thing I didn't like about it, though, because I liked that they made it, and I thought they did a fantastic job, but I really wish that they would have had a Jewish, or at least Jewish resembling actress play Rosa, because there was something about having somebody who looked so not Jewish play her that I think for people less familiar with those times and what it meant to look like Rosa, I think it was a lost opportunity.
Yeah, no, as my grandmother was saying Yiddish, the punum, the face, it was.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Yes.
Definitely not the Rosa punum. Okay.
Well, you know what I mean? Just that there was
Yeah,
something
no, I know, of course.
profound about her being not
Right.
only incredibly Jewish looking, but short, walking with a limp. I mean, and those things all had everything to do with the incredible person she was.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really agree with Jane that it's very hard, I think, for some of us to understand how brave she was. And I didn't think the movie got that, because part of her bravery was that she didn't despair. And, there's this whole part of Rosa Luxemburg literature that says she joined the Spartacus League because she lost her mind in prison. She didn't lose her mind in prison. She joined the Spartacus League because that was what was in the streets, and that's where revolutionaries are. And I thought the movie could have been stronger, and perhaps it's connected to Jane's point. They didn't get who she was at the deepest level. She was so revolutionary. This is a woman who never sought to be an academic or, her whole life was about revolution.
And I think too that, that she was somebody who experienced some of what was most beautiful about human life, but also had very good reason to try to build a very different kind of world. The world that she was born into was not one that was at all hospitable to the flourishing of her and her greatest aims. And that combination of loving human beings enough to fight for us, but also knowing, settling for what was for her would have been, she wouldn't have lived a life. It wouldn't have been a human life. There were no opportunities for her even to go to school past 15, which is why she joined an underground socialist movement where most of the leaders were hung, and she ended up having to flee to Switzerland, right? So she knew that she could learn from a whole range of people besides people in universities, but the world was not set up for Rosa Luxemburg, which was why she devoted herself so thoroughly and tirelessly to building one where she could flourish.
It's remarkable. I don't know if people are reading that, but the accumulation of capital, or as you call it, the magnus opum. I don't know if in universities, you're more in tune with that, but it's just, I remember trying to read it when I was at Columbia, and I think a little rough, but it's something.
But one of the things that's great about what's going on now, and we definitely have Peter Hudis to thank for it, is more and more of her work is available in English and in really good translation, which wasn't true until recently. And so, for instance, a lot of the transcriptions of her lectures that she gave in the trade unionist school are really readable. And so I find when I teach Rosa, I often actually begin with her letters and those lectures and then move towards the more technical stuff, because they're really rich with ideas, because she believed that it was her duty to make those ideas comprehensible to anyone who wanted to learn them. And she was really good at it. And so one of the things that's great about these new publications through Verso of her work in English is just that there's so many different points of entry now, which just wasn't true until very recently.
Including, as Jane mentioned, volume 4 is now out, which is her writings on revolutionary organization in the Revolution of Poland in 1906. So it's extraordinary. And that's an incredible service.
I got to say, your response in terms of music, I'm sorry, we can't address all, but if folks are looking at the chat, it's remarkable. The recommendations for music from Frank Zappa, Phil Lakuta, Bob Marley, Max Roach, Dina Washington. Oh, so we could carry on this conversation all day, but time is coming to an end. Is any final thoughts you'd like to, Jane, Drucilla, like to add before we say do svidania, au revoir, hasta la vista?
I think I would just say thanks so much for making the time and for recognizing the value of Rosa. And that I think anybody who encounters her is enriched by the encounter. So I see it as a favor to anyone to recommend that they engage with Rosa in whatever way, because there's so many different ways in, and all of them are valuable.
Yeah. I think her birthday was March 5th, so we're the 10th, so belated birthday, nothing, okay, it's within reason. I'd just like to thank everybody who did come. I love the chat. This is really engaging. book sandwiching will be coming to an end March 24th for our fall winter season. Hope you'll join us on the 24th. We're having Professor Gerald Horn. It's a senior moment. Sorry, I'm allowed that. Professor Gerald Horn, we're talking about his new book on boxing. That'll be at noon. And also, again, I'm going to bring up the book. I urge everybody, please read this. It's available, and I want to note that we are the only public library in the U.S. that has it. So it's like you said. Hopefully, is it coming on paperback, hopefully, or something?
It's paperback next May, but I would urge people if they want it
Okay.
sooner. The ebook is, if you're inclined to read ebooks,
Okay.
it's relatively affordable. The whole thing is there. And so if you want something before the paperback, the ebook is the next best option.
Okay.
But thank you to the library for purchasing the hardback. We appreciate
Absolutely. It's money well spent. It
is money well
That's
spent.
right. And also, please read it. We have some other, a lot of other bios on Rosa Luxemburg. Where Rosa Luxemburg Central, I think, compared to other libraries. If you're planning a revolution, this is the place to come. It's a place to get started. We have it's a great library. Anything, we cover a whole bunch of subjects. Great librarians, and again, thank you very much for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get to some of the chats, but it's really been engaging, and so hopefully we will see everybody again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.